So get this, these New Testament writers were not primitive. They faced the 21st century problem. It's exactly the same problem. Now, did Jesus' resurrection break the law of nature that people normally stay dead? No. You see, if I was claiming to you that Jesus rose from the dead by natural processes going on in the tomb before it happened, then it would be breaking the laws of nature. But I'm claiming no such thing. What the New Testament claims is God raised him from the dead. That is, there was an injection of power and energy from outside the system. It didn't happen by any natural means. It happened by supernatural intervention or input of power from outside. And we recognize that. There's a widespread impression these days that faith is believing where you know there's no evidence. That's what Dawkins thinks. Ladies and gentlemen, faith in the New Testament is never that. It's believing where there is evidence. The word faith in English comes from the Latin word fides, which means trust. We get fidelity from it. And the normal use of the word is trust based on evidence. And you'll discover that what that means the next time you go to get a loan from your bank manager. You want evidence before he gives you the loan, won't he? His trust in you has got to be evidence-based. But unfortunately, in the world of the academy that I inhabit, there's a widespread impression that faith is a religious word and it means believing where there's no evidence. That is completely wrong. And John, the writer in the New Testament, who gives us a lot of evidence on the resurrection of Jesus, he sums up what he's doing by saying this: Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples which are not written in this book. But these are written in order that you might believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that believing you might have life in his name. Here's the evidence upon which faith can be based. If Christianity wasn't evidence-based, you wouldn't have the New Testament because it claims to be evidence. It's a completely false idea. And Hume is right. And he's saying a big claim requires big evidence. Of course it does. And therefore, we need to investigate those things that will lead us to a reasoned assessment of why we should believe that Jesus raised from the dead. And one of the things he says is, if the falsehood of the testimony to an event like the resurrection would be more miraculous than the event itself, then I would have to believe the testimony, but not until then. You see, if someone claims something like Jesus rose from the dead, I have to decide whether it's true or false. If the character of the witness is dubious, then you might dismiss the story out of hand. But then you investigate the moral integrity of the witness. What about the people that wrote the New Testament? Were they morally compromised? No, they went out into the world in the name of truth and purity and morality. They stuck to this story. That's powerful evidence that they themselves actually believed it. How otherwise would you explain their stance? Were they fraudsters? Well, I shall never forget sitting in Trinity College, Cambridge, listening to one of the brightest legal scholars in the world of his time, Professor Sir Norman Anderson. And he's written a lovely little book, which I recommend to you even today, Evidence for the Resurrection. And he says this: Easter is not primarily a comfort, but a challenge. Its message is either the supreme fact in history or else a gigantic hoax. If it is true, then it is the supreme fact of history, and to fail to adjust one's life to its implications means irreparable loss. But if it is not true, if Christ be not risen, then the whole of Christianity is a fraud, foisted on the world by a company of consummate liars, or at best deluded simpletons. St. Paul himself realized this when he wrote, "If Christ be not risen, then our preaching is meaningless and your faith worthless." And centuries before Hume, Paul saw the issue clearly. Either Christ is risen from the dead, or he and the others are deliberate perpetrators of fraud. But then the question cannot be avoided. Is it possible to believe that Christ's disciples were the kind of people who not only would concoct a lie, but foist it on other people and watch them go to their deaths from it, and themselves go to their own deaths for the whole thing? I find that very difficult to believe. But that has been investigated by many forensic scientists, and I leave you to them to investigate that. The other thing I want to mention is the historical fact of the meteoric rise of the Christian church from a non-proselytizing religion, Judaism. What is adequate to explain the transformation of the early disciples from a frightened group of men and women who were utterly depressed and disillusioned at what to them was the calamity that had befallen their movement when Jesus died? There suddenly explodes this powerful international movement which rapidly established itself all over the Roman Empire. The early disciples were all Jews, their religion not noted for its enthusiasm in making converts. And if you ask the early church,
in the dialogue above, the speaker presents the argument that dismissing miracles as products of primitive ignorance misunderstands both ancient knowledge and the nature of miracles themselves, and I find this argument convincing. The assumption that pre-modern people were unaware of natural regularities is historically and logically flawed. Recognizing a miracle presupposes familiarity with what normally happens. The claim that ancient witnesses were naive functions less as an argument and more as a rhetorical shortcut that avoids engaging with the actual content of the testimony. An anomaly can only be identified against a backdrop of regularity. If ancient observers truly lacked an understanding of nature's patterns, they would have had no basis for labeling any event as extraordinary. This reasoning turns the skeptic's claim on its head. Familiarity with natural law is not an obstacle to miracle recognition, but a prerequisite for it. By emphasizing Luke's medical and historical training, the speaker directly challenges the caricature of biblical authors as uncritical or naive. Luke's deliberate attention to evidential difficulty signals an awareness of skepticism within his own culture, undermining the claim that belief in the supernatural was automatic or unexamined. Zacharias' disbelief highlights a crucial distinction. Religious belief can coexist with skepticism toward miracles. His refusal stems from a clear understanding of biological limits, not from atheism. This reinforces the claim that ancient believers were fully aware of natural constraints and did not casually accept supernatural claims without resistance. The claim reframes the resurrection as an event involving additional causal input rather than internal natural processes. This distinction is critical. If God acts from outside the system, natural laws remain intact. The argument thus preserves scientific integrity while allowing for divine agency. By distinguishing between internal natural causation and external agency, the speaker avoids a false conflict between science and theology. The analogy implicitly affirms scientific method while rejecting metaphysical naturalism as an unwarranted extension of science beyond its proper domain. By reclaiming the biblical meaning of faith, the speaker exposes a semantic shift that has distorted public discourse. Faith is not positioned as a substitute for evidence, but as a response to it. This correction dismantles a straw man frequently used to dismiss religious belief without addressing its actual claims. The linguistic clarification reinforces the rational dimension of faith. Trust without evidence is recklessness. Trust based on evidence is rational commitment. By anchoring faith in ordinary human practices, such as financial trust, the speaker bridges the gap between religious belief and everyday reasoning. This section reframes the conflict between faith and science by dissolving a false dichotomy. Miracles are not presented as violations of natural law, but as events involving external agency acting upon a lawful system. The testimony of scientifically informed figures within the New Testament further undermines the notion that belief in the resurrection arose from ignorance. Most decisively, faith is redefined not as blind belief, but as evidence-based trust. This reconstruction restores intellectual credibility to Christian belief and prepares the ground for evaluating the resurrection as both a historical and rational claim.
They will tell you immediately that what started it was the resurrection of Jesus. And their very existence, the meaning of their existence and its purpose was to bear witness to this fact. Professor C.F.D. Mole of Cambridge wrote, "If the coming into existence of the Nazarenes, a phenomenon undeniably attested by the New Testament, rips a great hole in history, a hole the size and shape of the resurrection, what does the secular historian propose to stop it up with? The birth and rapid rise of the Christian church remain an unsolved enigma for any historian who refuses to take seriously the only explanation offered by the church itself." Now, I'm coming towards the end of this section of the lecture. There are many, many more things that could be said. And I would encourage you, if you're beginning an interest here, to begin yourself to interact. I just want to mention one thing that many years ago, I was perhaps about 17, when I first listened to a very bright academic, classicist by training, talk about the resurrection. And he said there are innocent things that you'd hardly notice in the Gospels that are pointers that would never have been invented, never have been thought up in a fake story. And one of them is recorded in John's Gospel in chapter 20, where the women came and they said that the tomb was empty. Now that's very striking because Judaism did not regard the testimony of women very highly. And nobody faking a story would have ever claimed that women were the main bearers of the testimony. It's there because it's highly likely to be true. And they came and they said the tomb was empty, and Peter and John ran to the tomb. And they went into the tomb. And when they went into the tomb, John saw something that utterly intrigued him. It was a Jewish tomb, and the body would have been wrapped in grave cloths and heavy spices put on them. And he saw, it says, the grave clothes rolled up and the head cloth by itself. And then it says this, he saw and believed. Believed what? And he left the tomb. There was nothing more to be seen because what he had seen convinced him of the resurrection. What was it? He was like a detective. What he saw, according to the text, was the grave cloths were rolled up exactly as they had been on the body. How could that be possible? Because you see, if somebody had removed the body, they would have had to unwind them and then wind them up again. That would have been practically impossible. It would have taken hours. But if nobody had removed the body, John, it was like lightning going through his head. He saw and he believed. And that sticks in my mind over all those years. And there are many such things that bring us step by step. It's cumulative evidence. But you know, there's more to it than that. And I want to read to you just a few words of, if I can find them, 20 centuries ago. In the dawn of an Oriental day, a woman distraught at finding an empty tomb in a garden near the place of crucifixion saw a man standing in the shadows. Thinking that he was the gardener, she asked him if he'd removed the body of Jesus. He spoke her name, Mary. And in a moment of overwhelming understanding, she realized that this was not the gardener, but the owner the Lord of creation, the one who is ultimately responsible not only for all the beauty of flowers and trees, but for the whole universe in all of its prodigious glory. Jesus had risen from the dead. Death itself had been overcome. Atheism has no answer to death, ladies and gentlemen, no ultimate hope to give. It's an empty and sterile worldview which leaves us in a closed universe that will ultimately incinerate any last trace that we ever existed. It is quite literally a hopeless philosophy. Its story ends in the grave, but the resurrection of Jesus opens the door in a bigger story. It's for each one of us to decide whether it's true or not. Now, my final point is this. I'm a scientist of sorts. And people say to me, come on, you can't believe this stuff. Because in science and practical science, you do experiments, you test your hypotheses. Christianity is not testable, isn't it? Isn't it? You see, the difference between the two last things I read were the difference between seeing something, those grave cloths, and working out an intellectual conclusion that something utterly remarkable has happened. That's not quite the same thing as meeting the risen Jesus. And you see, ladies and gentlemen, if it is true that Jesus rose from the dead, and he's still alive, and it's possible to meet him. Now, you can do an experiment. And it's this. This Jesus who claims to be risen tells us that if we're prepared to trust him, repent of the mess we've made of our own lives and the lives of other people, and we're prepared to receive him as Lord and controller of life, as the risen Son of God, then he will give us forgiveness. Does the word forgiveness mean anything to you? He'll give us new life and a new power. And you know, I meet many people in life. And I'll tell you just one story to illustrate this. I was speaking to a huge crowd at Harvard University. And when I'd finished, a young Chinese student stood up at the balcony and he shouted to the whole crowd. He said, "Look at me." And of course, we all looked. And I said, "Why should we look at you?" He said, "Listen." His face was radiant with joy. He said, 6 months ago, my life was in a mess as a student. And I don't know all the things he mentioned that were wrong with his life and so on. He was in total despair. And he said, someone brought me to a lecture that you gave at one of the Ivy League universities, but not Harvard. And he said, just look at me now. He said, I've found peace with God. My life has been completely transformed. I've discovered meaning. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this is the test. When you see that in life again and again and again and again, when you see people with narcotic or alcohol dependence and they've no food to put on the table in front of their children, and you meet them then a year later and something has happened, you say, what's happened to you? And they say something like, well, I met Jesus, or I became a Christian, or they put it different ways. When you see that again and again, you add 2 and 2 and you get 4. I wouldn't sit here for a nanosecond if I didn't believe that not only is the resurrection of Jesus intellectually credible, but I believe it's existentially credible. Because the center part of my life and that of my wife and family is to walk with him from day to day. Now that may sound...
In the dialogue above, the speaker argues that Christianity explicitly presents itself as an evidence-based worldview, and I find this argument convincing. Rather than retreating from Hume's demand for proportional evidence, the speaker embraces it. The New Testament is portrayed not as a collection of mystical assertions, but as a body of testimony consciously offered for evaluation. This framing places Christianity within the same rational space as historical inquiry, where claims rise or fall based on the weight of evidence. Historical testimony cannot be assessed independently of character. The willingness of the New Testament witnesses to endure persecution, suffering, and death for their claims undermines the hypothesis of deliberate fraud. While sincerity alone does not prove truth, sustained moral consistency under extreme pressure significantly increases plausibility. The claim leaves no room for sentimental neutrality. If false, Christianity collapses. If true, it demands personal realignment. This binary structure resists reduction to mere moral symbolism and confronts the listener with the cost of indifference. The resurrection is framed not as inspirational myth, but as a historical claim with existential consequences. The psychological transformation of the disciples, from despair to fearless proclamation, demands more than gradual myth-making. Social movements do not typically arise from defeated messianic hopes. The resurrection is presented as the only explanation sufficient in scope and power to account for this sudden and sustained transformation. Historical reasoning is comparative. Explanations are weighed against rivals. The absence of a coherent secular account capable of explaining the birth and expansion of Christianity exposes a gap that the resurrection uniquely fills. Rejecting that explanation without offering a superior alternative weakens historical credibility. While personal experience cannot replace historical evidence, it can corroborate it. The invitation to do an experiment reframes faith not as passive acceptance, but as active engagement. This does not bypass reason. It extends inquiry from the historical past into lived reality. Individual testimonies vary in interpretive strength, but when such transformations recur across cultures, backgrounds, and circumstances, they form a pattern. This pattern does not coerce belief, but it adds experiential weight to the historical and philosophical case already established. The final section completes the cumulative case for the resurrection by integrating historical testimony, moral credibility, sociological transformation, and lived experience. None of these strands alone compels belief, but together they form a coherent explanatory framework that rivals any alternative account. The resurrection is presented not as an escape from reason, but as its culmination, where historical inquiry, philosophical coherence, and existential meaning converge. The refusal to engage this claim is shown to stem less from evidential deficiency than from the cost of its implications.